Carly and the Families First team for continuing to offer these wonderful presentations in the community. Not because I do them, but because they're so valuable. And the more you know about grief, the more you learn about grief and what it actually is, the easier the grief process is going to be as well. So tonight we're here to talk about a very significant relationship, and that's one that you had with your sibling or siblings. And although there's a lot of research on sibling relationships, there isn't a lot of research out there about what happens once you lose a sibling. And so when we run into that, then we don't know what your needs are. And so we look to you as a bereaved sibling to let us know what your needs are. We can speculate, those of us that are in the industry, but the more we hear from you, the better it'll inform the services that we provide you as well. So we're going to be here. This is a rather small group, so we're going to probably be here about an hour and a bit, depending on the interaction. It is a presentation in format, but because we are a smaller group, feel free to ask any questions, although this isn't necessarily a support group format. This is a very general overview, so I will not be able to speak about particulars regarding how your sibling died, or whether or not the death of your sibling leaves you now as an only child, which has its own characteristics and unique traits to it as well. So this is a very general overview. If this presentation leaves you wanting more, please come and talk to me, seek more resources as well, okay? The facility here, the washrooms are out the back door, both male and female. I'll ask if you want to take a break. If you need to get up at any point in time and stretch your legs, go out and get some fresh air. I will not be offended at all. So we're going to silence our phones, all of us. And we're just going to settle in right now, and I want you to kind of take a deep breath. Check in with your kind of internal landscape. How are you feeling right now? Did you have to drag yourself to come out here? Did you have to convince yourself? Were you looking forward to it? Okay, just get kind of in tune and allow whatever happens tonight, whatever feelings and thoughts that come to the surface, it's okay, be present with it. And so we're going to talk about that space that was your sibling's place in the family. So whether your relationship with your sibling in life was close and intimate, or maybe distant and a little bit more formal, or anything in between, you can be sure that it's marked by attachment as well as antagonism, caring as well as competition, and loyalty as well as lingering resentment. And those things aren't mutually exclusive to a healthy relationship. That's just the dynamic of having siblings. So there's no perfect sibling relationship, and not all sibling relationships are all that bad either. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about what is this thing you're going through. Okay, what is this thing called grief? What's unique about a sibling relationship? And what happens after they die? What things pop up that we as a society don't pay attention to, or don't pay attention to enough? And that leads to the next topic, which is that it becomes a forgotten grief. They used to call children many years ago, when they suffered a loss in childhood, whether it was a sibling or a parent or a grandparent, they used to be called forgotten grievers. It was as if They didn't have a right to grieve. But if you have the capacity to attach, you are running the risk of grief should they predecease you. We're going to talk about what kinds of changes happen in the family system as well as to yourself after the death of a sib. And then we're going to end with how do I cope with this and finding meaning. Now I'm not implying that that's where you need to be now, the last topic, the last bullet point. But these presentations are about hope as well. So whenever your journey takes you to meaning, finding meaning, creating meaning, then that's where you're supposed to be. So what is this we're talking about? It's a simple 5-letter word that can really turn your life upside down. It involves thoughts and feelings and behaviors. It's both very unique and yet very universal. So as I said, if you've got the capacity to attach, you run the risk of pain of grief. So even though all of you here have lost a sib, if I asked you each one of your stories, they'll be slightly different. They're going to be as unique as your fingerprint. And grief in general is a response to all kinds of losses. It's really separation anxiety, not having access to somebody or something we want. But you are not only grieving, you're also bereaved. And that's you're separated because of death. So grief is a response to any kind of loss. But bereavement, to be bereaved means to be separated as a result of death. And it affects us 5 ways. When we think about grief, we usually think about emotions. Sadness, longing, anger, resentment, guilt, maybe relief, jealousy. But grief doesn't. It would be great if it just affected us on the emotional realm, but it doesn't. Grief is equal to stress. Stress affects us physically. So you might find that your sleeping is affected, your appetite's diminished, or maybe you're emotionally eating. Any chronic conditions are exacerbated. You might have headaches, stomach aches, backaches. You might be exhausted at the end of the day, but can't fall asleep because your mind is still working overtime, right? It also affects us cognitively. When we're a little emotionally disrupted, when we're not at our baseline, that takes our frontal lobe thinking offline. Have you experienced having problems making decisions, remembering things? It's not permanent, and it's not you, it's grief. Your motivation is lacking. Your judgment. That's all grief related, because our brain, our emotional brain, is so focused on this reality that we want to resist. How can this be? Even if we expected the death, there is something called anticipatory grief, but it does not fully prepare you for life after the death of a loved one. And then it affects us socially. You feel like you're kind of out of step with your peers. Should you talk about them? Should you not talk about them? You might withdraw. You might find you're very clingy. You might find the people that you expected to be there, guess what? Can't be there for you. And that leaves you angered and frustrated and sad, and it feels like another loss. And all you're thinking about is your sib, especially if you're acutely grieving. And lastly, it affects us spiritually. And what we mean by that is, now what? Where do I go from here? How do I function? What meaning do I have in mind? Maybe your sib was your best friend. Maybe you were their mentor. Maybe they were your mentor. Now, who am I? So, think of grief as these things kind of overlapping. Discard the notion of stages. No stages in grief. Absolutely not. So anytime you read about it, anytime you hear about it, I'm in the anger stage, all you're telling me is you're experiencing anger at this moment. The next moment, you might be devoid of anger. So grief is more dynamic. It flows. It ebbs and flows. It changes. But that is also, it's also frustrating because the notion of stages gives us a sense of control. If there are 5 stages, then if I'm at anger, I'm closer to acceptance. But with this framework, which is more accurate, we relinquish control because grief is really in the driver's seat. It's preoccupying you. So we're going to figure out then what is it that I can control. So just like the waves in the ocean, you're not going to go against the waves of grief. Because like the waves of the ocean, it pushes you back to where you need to be. So don't expend any energy that you might not have available to you to repress it, to distract yourself. It'll only make the process more difficult. But unlike the waves of the ocean, we can't chart it. We can't predict what's going to happen. And that's why we don't like this process. We like being in control. So your job is to figure out what it is you can control in this process. Let grief have its way until you're able to manage it. Until it doesn't have to always get your attention. The more you distract, the more power you're giving it. Joan Didion said after she lost her spouse very suddenly, grief turns out to be a place none of us know until we reach it. And I'll take it one step further. You have to do the work if you're going to get through it. So knowing another person who's lost their sib maybe 5-10 years earlier doesn't necessarily mean they've done their work, their grief work. And I'm going to talk about that very shortly. What does that mean? So even though I said your grief is universal, or grief is universal, it's also very unique. And these are the things I'm going to want to know if you're a client of mine, because that helps me to formulate a little bit about what are you going through? How is this affecting you? So, who is this person who died and what meaning did they have in your life? Were you expecting their death? Was it sudden? Was it tragic? Were you prepared as best as you could be? Who's in your support system? And I don't mean quantity, I mean quality. And Alan Wolfeld has come up with the rule of thirds. I'm sure some of you have heard the rule of thirds. 1/3 of the people, so the people you know in your life and the people that come into your life can be loosely put into these 3 groups. 1/3 of the people will walk with you. And as Alan says, they'll companion you through the process. They'll be there no matter what. Even if they haven't gone through the experience, they'll ask you, what is it you need? What can I do for you? 1/3 of the people will push and pull you through the process. They'll give you a bunch of cliches. They'll minimize your grief. And 1/3 of the people will be basically neutral. So figure out who's in your good 1/3 and stay close to them. You want quality. And sometimes it can't be people in your life that existed before death. Maybe you have to seek that out yourself in support groups, online groups. What about your background? What informed your belief system, your perspective on life? And very closely tied to that, do you have any spiritual or religious beliefs? What's your worldview? Do you think that the world is a good place? That good things only happen to good people? And that you perceive yourself as being a good person? How could this happen to you? Especially if your sib's death was what we call out of time, was not expected. What's your age? What's your physical and mental condition right now? What other crises are going on? I ask when I do an intake, do you work? Do you work outside of the house? Are you working right now? Are you back to work? I need to know, are there financial issues going on that is going to impact your grief? But most important, what's your unique personality? And I can summarize that by saying you can be very, very sad, but are you the kind of person who sees life as the glass half full or half empty? If you tend to be the latter, then it is going to make this process much more difficult. Any questions about what I've talked about so far? So what do I do? How do I get through this? Well, nature has given us this wonderful mechanism called mourning. We just don't do it very well. It's basically your grief, your internal landscape gone public. How do I express my thoughts and feelings in a constructive way so that I don't hold on to it? With grief, we have no choice, but with mourning, you've got a choice. This is your grief work. So you've got to work on it. Time in and of itself is not going to take you to reconciliation. You have to use the time effectively. You can't make it go faster because you've read every book and you've attended all of Grieving Heart seminars. I had a client who is a retired nurse. And boy, she did her homework. But the results just weren't they according to her expectations. But Christine, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. I said, yeah, it'll come. It just won't come on our timetable. We need to do our grief work or our mourning in order to integrate the enormity of a death of a loved one. So we don't accept the death, we reconcile ourselves to it. We come to terms with it. We find a way to live with it so that it doesn't dominate our lives. It's part of our life story. So mourning, you're going to have to find an outlet for your grief. We love from the outside in, but we mourn from the inside out. So, what's mourning? Here's some examples. Anything else that's not up there that you think you're doing your mourning? So anything that is, hi. I'm sorry?
Do you have a microphone?
I do.
Okay, 'cause I'm hard of hearing. Sorry.
No, absolutely not. Don't apologize for that. Would you like to come maybe a little closer? And I can also raise my voice. Or you can, maybe Brianna can raise the volume a bit. Is anyone, yeah, you're having problems hearing me? Okay. Fair enough.
It's okay. I'm catching it every
I've never been told at home that I've got a quiet voice. I don't need a microphone at home. I think that's better? Is that better? Is that better? Okay, otherwise you're more than welcome to come sit a little closer.
I'm trying hard.
Well, I don't want you...
Hearing aids, but I don't put them in.
Okay.
To do that.
We can wait until you go home and get them. Well, I don't want you to work too hard. It was probably work enough to come here tonight. I'll try and speak up. So, can anyone add to this list? Anything else that you do to release your feelings? I made a new friend tonight, Michelle. And I'm going to ask Michelle, do you think riding horses is a way of mourning when you're feeling sad and you want to connect with yourself?
I've cried on my horse's shoulders many, many times.
So she's cried on her horse's shoulders many times. So anything that gives it expression. Courtney, you had your hand up.
I was going to say physical movement.
Yes.
Maybe exercise or dance even.
Absolutely, because we know that grief is physical. So whatever way that your personality feels comfortable. I am not going to make a crier out of someone whose body doesn't need to cleanse themselves that way. I'm not going to insist that you journal if you don't like journaling. But I do ask you to find whatever is comfortable for you. Art, music, dancing. I had a client once who, after her husband died very suddenly, she was left with 3 teenagers, and she was in her 40s, and she said, my life was very, very busy. She was doing her grief work, but there were times when she knew that she was so distracted by her family life that the grief was building. So she used to dose herself with Dave. She'd go and listen to his favorite tunes. Right? She'd listen to his favorite, and she would cry. And she would reminisce, and then she'd feel better. So whatever's in here has to be given voice somehow. However, it's very difficult to do that in this hurry up and get well society. We're very, very uncomfortable with displays of emotion unless they're happy. Unless they're joyful. We even apologize for our happy tears at weddings, don't we? That's just our body's way of regulating. We shouldn't be apologizing for a very natural process. And yet we do. And we have also been taught in this society that to be well means to be pain-free at any cost. And that's just not possible. And we do know that if you experience grief and don't mourn, it's destructive. Grief will get your attention. It will get your attention. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. You'll push people away. People will abandon you. You'll feel disconnected from others and yourself. So we've got this beautiful natural way to mourn. But, as I said, we can be very good at not feeling. So when I don't want to feel the pain, I might do any number of these activities. See that? I think you said you shop.
shop and I keep myself really distracted.
So that's very honest. So we do need distractions. We can't be occupied with it 24/7. But the brain can trick us into believing I'm doing well, and I'm just going to keep doing it then. I've got this. I've got this under control. I'm not crying. I didn't have a bad day today. So anything done to excess, if it's done in an urgent way, if you're rushing it, then you're engaging in mourning avoiding behaviors. And then if you come to me, after you've done that for a period of time, I'm going to be engaging in what we call grief therapy as opposed to grief counseling, supportive counseling, supportive education counseling. Because what's happened is your grief has already been derailed. It hasn't followed the normal, natural course. And then you run into prolonged grief, complicated grief. But when we do our mourning, it transforms that really painful, acute grief into what we call integrated grief. That's the grief we can live with. That's the grief where we're filled more with gratitude than with pain of loss. Questions, comments? Do you want me to repeat anything? Expand on anything? Yes.
What happens when you get compound grief? One after another, after another, after another, all in a row.
Grief overload you're talking about. So this lady talked about what happens when the deaths come one after another in a short period of time. And a short period of time could be a year.
Yeah.
Right? And I know that you've experienced that. You've shared that.
I actually just lost another one.
Another sibling?
I lost a sibling this month. I lost two sons.
Yes. So what happens is you have to be very, very gentle with yourself, first of all. But what's not unusual is that guilt may arise when you're thinking about one loved one, and all of a sudden you think, but I've got somebody else that's died. And you can feel very torn. So the first thing then is to understand that the brain can't think of two things at the same time. And that if we're focused on one loved one, it doesn't mean we don't love the other loved one. So be gentle with yourself, as I said. The process could be a little bit more complex. It's very important to have a really good self-care plan. Ask for what you need, accept help. Take breaks. Take grief breaks. Allow yourself to do that. You're still living. You can be sad, but you're still living. You have to try to maintain the balance. But it can be very overwhelming when there's cumulative deaths in a period of time. Yeah, I wish you well. The fact that you're coming out here and you've been out to other grieving hearts.
I'm a widow as well. So I just multiplies. But yes, I have.
So this is taking care of yourself. You're educating yourself. Hopefully you'll leave tonight with another tidbit of information that you can add to your repertoire of self-care skills. Okay? You're welcome. Anything else? So as you reflect on this picture, I just want you to think about a special memory that you have, or whatever memory that pops into your consciousness with your sib or siblings. Does it make you laugh? Does it make you cry? Would anyone like to share anything at all? Any stories? No? Okay. That's fine. So, what is it about sibling relationships that are so unique? Well, first of all, if your sibling didn't die an untimely death, it's potentially one of the longest relationships you'll ever have. If you're in a partnership, it's probably longer, you've known your sibling longer than your partner, than your friends, than your peers. And research shows that a healthy sibling relationship that endures and survives to the later years benefits us. Positive relationships, those that have had positive relationships report a higher satisfaction with life and lower depression rates. Socialization. So while our parents might teach us about formal rules, what to say, what not to say, what fork to use, when to say please and thank you, our sibs teach us the nuances of socialization. What to do on the playground, right? What to do in school. They're the ones that we can test things out on. They're the ones we feel safe with, and they will give us their brutal honesty in response. What better way? I mean, that's what the family system is supposed to do. It's supposed to be a safe space where you learn the rules of life. And then you take it out there and practice. It's also a form of rivalry. Many parents still hold the notion that if you share the same blood, you have to get along. And we're talking about a healthy sib relationship. We know that it's just a natural outcome that siblings compete with each other for their parents' attention, their love, their resources. And that's not a bad skill to have, because our needs have to be met. And it's also companionship. Now, when you were younger, you may not have wanted to take your little brother or sister along with you. But if you have a healthy relationship, if you had a healthy relationship, if you chose to be with your sibling in adulthood, it was by choice. They can be your best friend. However, even though this relationship is so significant, the grief after their death is silenced. It's almost like you don't have a right to grieve because it was only your brother or your sister. The focus after a death, if your sib was in a partnership, is usually on their partner or on your parents who have lost a child. And that's not diminishing those losses. But society seems to have a hierarchy, wouldn't you agree? Yeah? Oh, I see everybody's head nodding. Right? Sibling loss. It's not regarded as significant. And yet we just talked about how significant that relationship is. And that doesn't translate then into what your needs are once you've lost that relationship. Adults have talked about how they were forced to have to bring in sunshine into their parents' lives after their sibling died. They felt an obligation. And then there's also that myth, once you're an adult, you're not impacted by the death any longer. Well, we're not talking about living under the same roof. We're talking about attachment. Now, certainly if you were living under the same roof, your lives would intertwine more. But if that attachment is strong, it doesn't matter. If they lived halfway around the world, if you FaceTime them every week, you're going to miss that. Maybe you find you weren't involved in the funeral planning, and yet you knew that person so well. You felt you didn't have a place to share your input. Within days of my brother's death, I learned an important lesson. I learned no matter how paralyzed with grief and sorrow I might have felt, society does not recognize the death of a brother or sister as a major loss. Comprehending this, I retreated into the shadows, a place where other brothers and sisters go to mourn, and waited for the sadness to pass. What this author is describing is an experience with disenfranchised grief. That's grief that's not recognized as much as you need it to be recognized. That's grief that goes underground. You might have had dismissive condolences. And then you start to question your grief. You're right to feel sad and to have a place in line. You do have a right to grieve and mourn. A partner's death, a partner's grief, parents' grief, are just as important as your grief. They're just different. So you've got a right to ask for support and expect it. Siblings help us know ourselves. They offer a mirror to our uniqueness, both as an individual and as a family. Their death changes the family to exist in new ways. Has that been anyone's experience here? Yeah, I see some nods. Think of your family of origin, as parts of a child's mobile. And one or two or three parts have been pulled from it. That mobile is going to be off balance, isn't it? It's not going to operate the same way as when they were there taking up that space. So now you've got to kind of negotiate a new family dynamic. And that's no small order when you're grieving and you're hurting. So what happens after a death? So we already know, right, that the death may receive little or no acknowledgement, societal acknowledgement. Well, first of all, you've lost a close relationship. But once again, because you're an adult, it's minimized. And then these new roles come to the forefront. Maybe now you find yourself automatically taking the role on as comforter, right? Bringing sunshine into your parents' lives. Maybe you feel you have to amp up your game now if your parents are alive. Maybe you become a caregiver. If it was an older sibling, have you moved up the ranks? Are you now the eldest sibling? Or, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, if it was your only sibling, now you're an only child. What does that mean? Do I have to take on more responsibility now for my parents and my family? And you have to also take into consideration that because society minimizes this bereavement experience, are you, or have you internalized some of those messages? Are you naturally just stepping up to the plate? When you really want to say, I'm hobbling as well, I hurt too. This is what I can do, but I also need some time for myself. You could end up feeling selfish. But self-care is not the same as selfish. And remember, we always have to put our oxygen mask on first before we help anyone else. Because otherwise you'll be no good to anybody. If your sibling was in a relationship, you may have fears that you're going to lose connection with them. Maybe nieces and nephews. How does that dynamic work now? Are they still my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law? You may experience regret and guilt. Now, once again, grief is not logical. Remember, it takes our brains offline. It's all driven by feelings and emotions. So many times when one experiences guilt or regret, it's misdirected. But you could experience survivor guilt. Why am I here? Why did my younger sibling die? Can I go on and still live a full, happy life? Do I have a right to? And once again, your logical brain will say, of course you can, but your heart's driving everything right now. And so that's what you have to process. I know I shouldn't have any feelings of guilt, but I do. So we do the woulda, coulda, shouldas. And that's okay. We need to pull it apart, but we don't use it to beat ourselves up. So survivor guilt has to be brought to one's consciousness. Anything that we keep inside, once again, hardens and freezes and goes with us as we move forward. And then, who am I now? Do I still have a brother or a sister or sisters or brothers? If someone asks me how many siblings do I have, what's my answer? I know that's a really prevalent question with parents who have lost a child. Are they still my child? Yes. Are they still your brother or sister? Of course they are. But you say what you feel, what resonates with you and your nature and your personality. Any comments, questions, disputes? No? Our brothers and sisters are there with us from the dawn of our personal stories to the inevitable dusk. So we don't have closure. after they die. There's no such thing as closure. You have to let your process unfold so that you naturally find what we call a continuing bond with your sib as you move forward. At one point in time in Freud's day, the thinking was you would draw all your energy from the deceased person and you reinvested it somewhere else. And recent research says that that's, first of all, not possible, and it's not healthy because we can't erase that significant relationship we've just talked about. So what we prescribe to now is that as the process of grief unfolds, as you do your grief work, as you feel the pain, as you release it, it lightens, it changes in shape. Grief then softens and it recedes to the background. And we naturally then find ways to remember. Whether it be you go out for their birthday or you wear their special color. Whatever it is that feels right to you so that you can continue a bond as you move forward, because the world is still spinning. You still have life in you. What legacy would you like them to have? What was the legacy they left you? How would you like to remember them? We have to look back before we can move forward. Life is lived forward, but it's understood backward. So we can't rush through this process. Any significant relationship after the person has died needs the respect and time to mourn them. So I'd like you to work through your grief so you can come to a place of finding meaning. Don't accept other people's meaning. Don't buy into anybody else's, well, this is how you should feel. Or at least you had them for this long. Or at least they're not in pain any longer. Or they're in a better place. No, you find meaning, you give meaning to your special relationship. And in order to find meaning, in order to find that continuing bond, there's certain things you can do. Who was this person? What do they bring into your life? How did they change you? How did they influence you? The good, the bad, the ugly, everything. You have a right to treasure your memories. You have a right to talk about them. Please don't censor yourself when you're in social situations. If it naturally comes up, my brother this, my sister, you've got a right to do that. Your right isn't to make someone else happy or comfortable. Keep them alive by talking about them. That is the best way. One of the things my clients fear most is as they come through their grief, their fear is forgetting. Well, I can say that that's impossible. You don't forget. It's just that we're comparing, or we feel we're forgetting, because at the beginning of the grief process, it's right in front of our faces. But we can't forget. We're just not focused on their loss. I talked about continuing tradition. I always use this, this isn't continuing a tradition, but Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, is a continuing bond with her daughter. And look at how many people that's positively impacted. Do something to honor their memory. It doesn't also have to be as grand as Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It could be something very private. between you and your sibling. Maybe you give of your time in memory of them. Make a donation in their memory. What causes did they subscribe to? What was important to them? And also, one of the things that come out of a healthy grief experience or a mourning is that we learn to be more grateful for those that we do have in our life. Practice intentional living. And live fully in their memory. What better legacy? And once again, if you do the mourning, this can come naturally. It doesn't have to be forced. But you've got to do the grief work to get here. So, I'd like you to take away some of these tips. Grief work, mourn, mourn, and mourn. Find out what's good for you, what suits your personality. Practice self-care on those 5 realms: emotional, physical, cognitive, spiritual, and social. Learn to say no. Learn to be okay with not today. I need this. You have to resist that temptation that your grief isn't important in order to make some changes as a whole, as a collective whole. No, I have a right to feel this way. And I'm going to find people, like-minded people, who honor that. If you have siblings, family members, keep lines of communication open. One of the things that is a misconception in a family system is that, and it's subconscious, and that is, if we're all grieving and mourning the same person, then we should kind of basically be doing it the same way. And it doesn't happen, because it goes back to the relationship you had with that person. The eldest won't have the same relationship as the youngest with the middle child. So we're grieving that relationship. And so keep the lines of communication open when other members of the family, their experience differs from your experience. Grief bursts. That's when you feel like you've got this, you've got a hold of this. And all of a sudden grief taps you in the shoulder and says, you haven't been paying attention to me. That's okay. It doesn't mean you haven't done your work. And that can come years and years later. It's okay. I prefer to call it a grief embrace. Like your sibling saying, remember me? Yeah, I do. Yeah, I miss you. Establish a continuing bond. Again, don't have to work on it. It can come naturally. And if you think you need to seek an objective third party, seek professional assistance. Or support groups. I'm affiliated with Julian's House, which is a fairly new bereavement organization, and Courtney is here in the audience. She's the bereavement coordinator, program coordinator, and they will be launching a sibling loss group. And when does that start, Courtney?
That starts next Thursday night.
Next Thursday night. So that is available in this community. A sibling loss group for adults. So Julian's House recognizes the importance of that relationship. And if you haven't heard of Julian's House, just look it up. So, final thoughts. Grief is normal, natural, and necessary. You've got to feel it to heal it. You cannot get through this unscathed without feeling it. Grief will affect your head, heart, body and spirit, all at the same time. If you've got any spiritual beliefs, and if they bring you solace, rely on it. Question it if you need to. Remember that there's no stages. As seductive as that is, it will soften, it will recede when you've done the work. And it's okay to laugh. It's okay to cry. It's okay not to be okay. And it's okay to be okay. And it's okay to find your way to living fully, because that is probably the best thing you can do in memory of your sibling. And I'm going to leave you with this. At the end of the day, all you need is hope and strength. Hope that it will get better, and strength to hold on until it does. So thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for joining us via live streaming. You're showing me that your willingness to engage in the process, acknowledge that you had a special relationship with your sibling in life, and that you can continue to honor them in death as well. Any questions or comments before we end? Michelle?
I would just like to say, Christine, that I'm here after losing 4 siblings and both of my parents, very young ages, over the last 13 years. And I just want to say thank you to you, because you have given me a lot of things to think about, because now I feel like it's not forgotten. I was
Good.
never forgotten, and shouldn't have had to feel that way. So thank you for what you bring out into the community, and I know Julian's house is going to do that too, but I just wanted you to know, because oftentimes I'm apologizing to people that I still am grieving, right? Or, so,
Yep.
so thank you for that, because I feel I have lots to think about, and it's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay.
And it starts with you, right? It starts with me. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I'm glad that this presentation has given you permission and hope. Thank you. And I'm glad I met you tonight. Anything else? Any questions? Last minute thoughts? Anything, Brianna? From cyberspace? No? Okay. Thank you very much, and I wish you well in your journey, and safe ride wherever you are going. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Most welcome.